Welcome everybody to this live LinkedIn Live event on the intersection of FuelEU Maritime and wind assist propulsion systems. And this is where we'll focus on navigating the path to compliance through efficiency. In Njord, we act as an industry catalyst, working with owners and charters to accelerate the uptake of energy efficiency technologies. So when regulations start to incentivize technology uptake, like the FuelEU Maritime, then we are naturally very excited and also committed to explore that further. So today, our invited industry experts will explore how the new regulation incentivizes the adoption of wind assist propulsion and what are the best practices when exploring the complementary opportunities between the two. We'll also take a look at the financial, operational, and regulatory benefits of installing wind assist propulsion and which strategies to pursue to maximize the FuelEU Maritime compliance rewards, including examples of how to achieve attractive or even sub 5-year return on investment for wind assist propulsion. We want to highlight some practical insights and real-world examples, which showcases how to align wind assist propulsion with FuelEU Maritime regulations. It's important for me to mention that as an audience, you are highly encouraged to ask questions to our panels as we go through. So you can actually already now use the LinkedIn comment function and start typing in comments and questions, and we'll try to cover as many of them throughout the session as possible. To that extent, we have also prepared a poll for you to answer because we are super curious to see where are you currently when it comes to this regulation and wind assist propulsion. So we prepared a poll here for you to answer. Have you calculated the business case behind applying wind assisted propulsion on vessels in your fleet, including how FuelEU Maritime affects the return on investment? The way to participate in this poll is simply to scan the QR code, go to the site, and then just click in your answer. So again, have you calculated the business case behind applying wind assisted propulsion on vessels in your fleet, including how FuelEU Maritime affects the return on investment? We'll get back to this poll as we go through. We'll leave it up here for a second or two with the QR code as I introduce the panelists. Okay, so with that, super excited to get this panel going. We'll start with our very first panelist, which is Kate Foster. Kate, she brings with her 21 years in the shipping industry, comprised of 15 years in chartering and 6 in other commercial roles, including gas and power scheduling and tanker operations. Kate is a senior freight trader on Maersk Tankers customer solution desk, negotiating and handling contracts of affreightment while optimizing EU ETS, FuelEU compliance, etc. And currently also seconded 20% of your time, Kate, to the Center of Zero Carbon Shipping, the Maersk Mc-Kinney Møller Center, modeling business cases related to EU ETS, FuelEU Maritime, CSRD impact, and increasing focus on anticipated IMO's proposed midterm measures. That was a long introduction, but a big welcome to the call, Kate. It's
Thank
super
you.
good to have you here.
Thanks.
Our next panelist is Gavin Allwright. Gavin is the Secretary General of the International Windship Association, a member-driven organization of over 200 maritime stakeholders, including wind propulsion technology providers, ship owners, and research centers. He represents IWSA at the International Maritime Organization, so again, IMO, and sits on the European Sustainability Shipping Forum. Gavin also advises various maritime projects and initiatives as a non-executive board member of the World Wind Energy Association as well. I hope that introduction also gave you justice. Gavin, a big welcome to the call as well.
Thank you very much, and a pleasure to be here.
It's great. Last but not least, we have Jonas Rasmussen. Jonas is the client director at Njord, where he is responsible for all commercial activities. He has been in the maritime industry for more than 13 years, working within various areas. And for the last 8 years, he has been working within energy efficiency, latest as CEO of Sea Lean Ships, who's delivering complete range of biofouling management services. And a big welcome to the call to you as well, Jonas. Okay, good stuff. Then with that, we will basically get going. And I think first thing actually is to set the scene, just so we know what we're talking about today. The first one is FuelEU Maritime. Well, I'll just give a quick brush up for those who are unfamiliar before we start deep diving into how it incentivizes wind assisted propulsion. So the FuelEU Maritime is an EU regulation which is aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions from ships. It sets limits on the carbon intensity of the energy that the ships will use, encouraging the adoption of cleaner fuels and technologies as well. Starts in 2025, so it's actually up and running, and is set for review in 2027. Applies to ships above 500 gross tonnage operating in EU ports, with progressively tighter requirements over time. And under the FuelEU Maritime, wind assisted propulsion technologies are incentivized by allowing ships to account for the energy saving they provide when calculating their carbon intensity. So this is where it gets interesting. And basically, that's the next element that we will cover now. Because we want to deep dive and get a clear understanding of how FuelEU Maritime incentivizes the application of WAPS. And we've cheated a bit because we asked our audience before we started, so where are they currently on the understanding of how that is set? And it's quite clear to see here from the graph that it's only 5% who consider themselves to be very familiar with how this regulation actually incentivizes this particular technology. 55% somewhat familiar, 20% not familiar at all, and then 20% learning more at this event in January, so our event here today. So it seems as if there's room for more knowledge and more insights. So I'll pass on this first question to you, Gavin, and let you explore a bit. So how FuelEU Maritime incentivizes the application of wind assisted propulsion.
Yes, thank you very much. I'll keep this brief. There is a lot of information out there that delves deeper into what FuelEU Maritime is. Just basically, this is an incremental carbon intensity regulation. So by 2025, there's a 2% increment reduction in the carbon emissions. That increases to a 6% increment between 2030 2035. And the effective date, I think everybody's aware, this is already now in effect. And there are penalties for non-compliance. And those equal 2,400 euros per ton of VLSFO equivalent. But of course, the effective penalty will be the lowest cost alternative fuel. So that's the headline or the benchmark number, but the effective penalty will be a little bit lower than that. From a wind propulsion perspective, FEUM, it gives a benefit to the installed wind propulsion capacity. And what this is really a nod towards the fact that wind propulsion, or the energy delivered, is not in fact an energy efficiency measure, but it's an energy provision measure, that you are providing energy to the vessel. And for that, rather than it being incorporated into the formula, which was a little bit complex when this was being developed back in 2020, 2021, the decision was to give a wind reward factor of between 1% and 5%. And that is assessed based on the amount of power or amount of energy delivered by the system. So if, for example, if you're in the mid-range, you're getting a 10% power delivery from your wind propulsion system, you get a 3% increment. So your wind factor is 0.97. And indeed, if you did that, you would be compliant between 2025 to 2030. So that 2% would be delivered. But you would also receive a 1% on top of that, which can be either banked, or you can lend that, or you can pool that with the other vessels in your fleet. So hopefully that gives you an idea, a rough idea of how wind propulsion delivers. And please remember, this is before you get the benefits from using the wind propulsion in reduced fuel burn and also the EU ETS as well. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for explaining this, Gavin. And I think you hit an important part here, saying applying on the actual wind assisted propulsion system can be a business case in itself, but then there's this extra, you could say, avoidance of penalty or a way of complying with the FuelEU Maritime. But the interesting part, I mean, the crux of it, I guess, comes down to the reward factor, if I'm not mistaken. Can we double click around how are they then determined? I mean, this 1% versus 3% versus 5%. I mean, how do you arrive at that? Who sets that basically?
Yes, so this is based on an imperfect calculation, but the calculation that we have from the IMO around the EEDI, EEXI calculation in Circular 896, which looks at the global wind matrix is included. 50% of the power that is delivered, or 50% of the operational profile, is then taken, and the energy delivered from that system is then assessed from there. But one of the issues is obviously it's capped at that 15% or above. And this is one of the changes that we'd like to see. We'd like to see that cap removed in the future.
Interesting. Okay. But then I guess it becomes super crucial when considering whether wind assist propulsion is the right choice for you to be aware of what kind of reward factor to expect when assessing the different technologies.
Indeed, indeed.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean that's going to be part of your calculation, and obviously there you'll be talking with the technology providers, but independent organizations, organizations such as Njord as well can direct you towards the calculations and the assessment of those.
Okay. Super interesting. I'm curious to see what kind of questions that we'll get from the audience around how this wind assist propulsion is actually incentivized under the regulation. And just a reminder again to the audience that you can ask questions along the way, and I'll try to keep track of it and post them as we go along. Thanks for covering this, Gavin. I think this is a great start to our conversation today.
Yeah, and
But
maybe
then-
I should.
yeah.
Sorry, maybe I should just mention as well. This is applicable to vessels over 5,000 GT. So that may change, but I just thought I'd mention that as well.
Yeah, good point. Good point. And the subject to what will change, etc., and what is being pushed for is also something that we hope to cover today. So with the notion that this new regulation has now come into force 2025, it has been known for a while that it would incentivize the application of wind assist propulsion. Then a natural lead-in is the question of saying, okay, so what kind of trends are we then seeing in the uptake of wind assist propulsion? And do we actually believe currently that they are propelled by the kickoff of FuelEU Maritime? This is a question we'll take around for the entire panel here. I'll start with you, Gavin, first, and your perspective on this.
Yes, so I'll give the overall trend and then maybe identify elsewhere as well. So the overall trend, we are seeing a sizable increase in interest in wind propulsion. We've actually doubled the number of installations on a vessel by vessel basis. So we're at 54, 55 vessels installed. These are large vessels over 400 GT. And we're seeing a pipeline of around about, I think, 80 on order. And that's accelerating quickly. But we're also seeing an increase in the number of rigs that are being put onto vessels. So up from 1 or 2 installations on each vessel, in some cases 4 or 5 installations of a rig. So really substantial wind propulsion deliveries. And we're starting to see fleet orders as well. I know Maersk Tankers is one of those, Union Maritime, Louis Dreyfus Amateur. So we're seeing multiple orders coming in for fleet installations rather than single or individual vessels. Now, so very quickly, we are certainly seeing anecdotally that FuelEU Maritime is a significant factor. It's being brought up almost in every decision-making meeting that we're hearing about, and also in the discussions in general around the industry. So yes, it is having an impact. What exactly that impact is, putting metrics on that is a little bit difficult at the moment because we have a flurry of other regulatory discussions, EU ETS, the IMO, global, etc.
So super interesting to see or hear doubling of installations and also counting one installation, but actually also number of rigs that goes on. Also says something about the scope of the installation and that FuelEU Maritime is part of the discussion in every forum that you are exposed to. Let's turn our heads to Kate. I mean, representing an owner like Maersk Tankers, I mean, what are the discussions here and what kind of trends are you seeing of those discussions? Is FuelEU Maritime kicking those discussions into motion?
Yeah, well, firstly, as Gavin said, according to Clarkson's World Fleet Register, those WAPS units currently in operation, they're predominantly found on general cargo and bulk carriers. And 52 of those were fitted since 2020, which would suggest that the uptake is linked to Fit for 55 package, which was developed back in 2021. And it's very much a topic at the forefront of owners' considerations now. And when you look at the 90 units on order, there's a 7-fold increase on tankers, up from 5 to 55. And this will include flat narrators and a big increase in suction sales, which we boarded here at Maersk Tankers. And like you said, they tend to be, originally they were individual orders, but we are beginning to see multiples, such as our order, which I think it's because owners are looking to gain experience with wind-assisted power incrementally. And we would expect to see this trend continue with the IMO midterm measures set to come into effect as early as 2027. So yeah, it's a big topic here.
And I guess, I mean, can you share some insights on that order which was placed recently, which was one of the biggest in the industry so far by Maersk Tankers? I mean, was FuelEU Maritime part of the discussion, and did it also come about as a consequence of new regulations pushing for adoption of wind?
Yeah, definitely. And the 5 units that were chosen, we originally looked at flat narrators. But then you have to take into account the operational trading pattern of the vessels. So then when you bring into air draft considerations, then the orders actually switched to suction sales due to the air draft restrictions in the end. So yeah, definitely some practical considerations here. And whilst there was a viable business case in its own right, when you add Fuel EU, it's another measure as the portfolio of methods that you can use to comply, as well as pooling and banking. So looking forward as well into IMO midterm measures, we would expect the impact to be amplified globally with this trading.
And that's a super important point, which we'll also get back to. I mean, but super interesting to hear. I like your points, Kate, around the timing and line of events from introduction of regulation when we start seeing that will be a part of the regulation, and how the orders are then ramping up in accordance to. But also interesting to hear that FuelEU Maritime was a direct link to making that order and making that step from a Maersk Tankers perspective. Let's turn our heads to you, Jonas. Jonas, it was also interesting to hear from Kate that she's looking at different segments in shipping and what has uptake. You interact with a lot of different owners across the globe in your capacity through Njord, advising across the border on energy efficiency technologies, not only wind. So when you reflect on this question here, I mean, what do you see of trends in the market currently?
I think compared to what we saw just a year ago, it's definitely picked up. There's a lot more interest in it. It's also gone from looking at piloting, basically, so trying out maybe one sail, putting it on one vessel. It's more a fleet adoption or over several sister ships. So there's a definitely increase, and more and more are looking at it, and it is the FuelEU that's pushing it. There is also, of course, owners that are looking at it purely that they know the vessel has a long-term fixed trade that is very favorable for wind, and it makes sense in just pure saving. So there's both, but the FuelEU is pushing it right now. We also see it from a supplier side. There's a lot of new companies coming up, and there's a few that's been established for quite some time, but there's a lot in the pipeline also coming up with both new ways of doing it outside of the main 3, but also trying to go into the market. So it's a sign that everyone is seeing the FuelEU is going to change, plus whatever might come, that there's a very big market for this coming up.
Super interesting, and we'll get back to the supplier side of things as well and how that has developed. I would definitely like to hear your thoughts on that. But what you're saying is basically that FuelEU Maritime has become part of the discussions. I'm curious. I mean, do you have conversations with owners where, let's say, 6 months or a year past or back, they were not mentioning or interested in looking into wind as a technology, but it was other energy efficiency technologies where the conversation has changed, and now suddenly there's a renewed interest to look into what the business case looked like and how that could be established on their fleet?
there are some conversations where for a long time we've always brought it up as a possibility because we've known this is coming, but the interest has not been there. But now when you're then coming back and if it fits with dry docking and so on, then yes, there's a renewed interest in starting to look at it in general. But I would say a lot of it is also just new clients reaching out and just saying, we have this, but how do we do what?
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jonas. Then let's move on because Gavin, you almost couldn't help yourself. We should also take a look at, okay, does it then apply to all kinds of technologies? Is something trending over the others? You mentioned in the beginning that this reward factor is something that's being established, and that depends a bit on the technology or the solution chosen. So let's take a dive into this next question. When it comes to the different types of technologies, are there then any wind assisted propulsion which are trended compared to others? Again, linking it up to, is it propelled by what we believe will fit the bill when it comes to the Fuel EU Maritime? Gavin, your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, again, trends are always a challenge to look even over a 2 to 3 year period. One thing I will say is that we're moving into these fleet orders. So if we look at just the simple numbers, those can be skewed by the latest fleet orders. So if you're looking at 20 or 50 units being ordered, suddenly that's the front runner until next week when 50 units are ordered from another technology. But the three main groups, if you like, which are in that front race at present are the rotor sails, which have been mentioned before, suction sails or suction wings, which have also been mentioned, and the other one are rigid sails or hard sails. And each one of those are securing multiple orders now. We're seeing a lot of interest in Asia as well. So there's developments there that are going on. And the other soft sails and kites that we've seen, each of those are going through slightly different innovation cycles. So we should see those re-emerging or emerging in different segments at different times. But I would say that this is having an impact across the board. Interestingly, one area that we are seeing some significant growth, which isn't necessarily pushed by this, but everything helps, is the primary wind area, where you're looking at vessels that's a 50% plus wind. And in that area, you do get a significant boost from Fuel EU Maritime, but it's not comparable to the fuel reduction in those vessels. And most of those vessels are fairly small at present.
Okay, got it. Super interesting, and an interesting perspective, saying that because some of the recent orders are so large in size, it actually skews the picture of what a realistic trend looks like, because we're not maybe that high in terms of total number of orders yet, even though those numbers have also increased. Interesting perspective. Kate, over to you. You also started to talk about, I guess, technology choice here. If you are banking on Fuel EU in the business case and you want to see that basically help take the business case across a magical number in terms of return on investment?
So yeah, I would argue that as opposed to what's trending, a vessel's operational profile is of more significance than what's trending. It has to fit in with our vessel's trading pattern. And so yeah, in the example before I gave of the 5 MRs, they're predominantly trading in the Atlantic Basin. There are some air draft restrictions there, so the technology that we've chosen has to fit in with the trading profile. That said, owners and operators are always interested in technological breakthroughs, especially to the extent that they can reduce the cost per unit. And I think it's putting the technology within reach of more owners than say 5 years ago as the cost per unit decreases. So then, yeah, we potentially see further multiple orders.
Okay, super, but interesting. So again, we cannot just, on a basic perspective, say, okay, which technology do we believe is the most effective one? It also comes down to now, how the vessels are trading and if there are any operational restrictions from the vessel's perspective. Jonas, super keen to hear from a broader view of your interactions, not representing an owner, but having had discussions with multiple owners. What are the different trends that you are seeing and hearing through those conversations?
I think it's mirroring Kate's answer. It's basically it all depends. We don't like to push a specific technology. All three main types, as Gavin is mentioning, are all viable. It's rotors, suctions, wings, or maybe also some of the new ones are viable. It all depends on the vessel, and it depends on the business case that the owner is basically investing into. And then it's finding whatever fits best. So we've seen for some smaller vessels, there are certain types of technologies that are better. For larger vessels, you have other things. So it depends on what are the vessel, how it's trading, and what business case are trying to achieve. What are your parameters?
Okay. And I guess there's a lot of work that goes into making those calculations and figuring out what's the right choice. So making a fleet-wide adoption of wind is maybe not super easy, especially if you have different sizes, sectors of or types of vessels, and also different trading patterns, basically.
Yeah, I think it's a good example is the Union Maritime. Their order, if you look a bit into that one, is that on the bigger vessels they've gone with wing sails, as far as I remember, and on the smaller ones they've gone rotors. So they have mixed and matched depending on what vessels they are and how they're trading, without knowing in detail their business case. So you have to look at it, and it's quite complex in how to do it.
Okay, super. Thanks, Jonas. And the complexity is something that we will also go back to and figure out, okay, so how to manage that in specific. Before we move into the next question, and thanks for running through the different types of technologies and the trends that we're seeing at the moment, we have a question from the audience where it just brings us back to the regulatory perspective. Gavin, I would like you to cover this one here. I'll just show it on the screen. It comes from Ravindra, who's asking, what are the penalties for non-compliance with fuel maritime standards, and how are they enforced? So maybe you can dive a bit into that.
I can certainly talk to the penalties. The enforcement issue, it's not something that I've taken a deep dive into. But definitely from the penalties side. So that €2,400 per ton of VLSFO equivalent, that is the penalty that will be put in. So if you fail to comply to the 2% reduction, you will have to pay that per ton of VLSFO equivalent. Now, there is also an incremental charge if you remain, I believe, if you remain non-compliant each year, then it can increase by 10%. So by 2030, that would be substantially building as well. So the drive very much is to emphasize compliance as soon as possible. And then obviously the 6% kicks in 30 between 2030 and 2035. So you then, again, 6% up until 2035, but increasing at 10% increase there. I would say that the compliance, I believe, the enforcement will be through the ship owner, the person responsible for paying, for example, EU ETS. I believe it's the same structure. And obviously, if you're not paying this, then you risk not being allowed to operate within EU ports or making EU port calls at all.
Okay, thanks, Gavin. Before we move on, there's actually another question. As anticipated, there's quite a number of questions related to the regulation itself. So we'll try and see how we can cover it, but I'll post it up here as well. It comes from Gunnar, who's asking here, in light of the Fuel Maritime, will the actual effect of sales just be theoretically assessed, or will this be estimated by performing something like a VTI, so Vessel Technical Index analysis based on weather normalization using accurately measured wave, current, STV, wind data, etc.? Super interesting question here. I'll start with you, Gavin, on the regulatory aspects here and your thoughts on this.
Yeah, in this first iteration, that's theoretical, if you like, that theoretical assessment is what is going to be based upon. This was a detailed discussion of this back in 2021, 22, as the regulation was being developed. And, the way of assessing wind propulsion, we actually have a submission going into IMO relating to this, and this will be brought back into Fuel EU Maritime discussions on the review as well. So I believe that you can, if you believe that the actual performance is higher than what is specified within the Circular 896, I believe that there is a process that you could apply for that higher level, or you could query that assessment. But I'm not 100% sure on that. And I think that that's going to come out a little bit as the regulation moves forward. So look, certainly we would like to see multiple ways of proving the savings being applicable within the regulation.
But we do agree at the moment, Gavin, that in order to reach the reward factor, it is actually a theoretical calculation up front.
Yes.
In reality, you could apply wind technology on the vessel and actually not having it running for multiple reasons, but then still get the reward factor and reduce the penalties endured by Fuel EU Maritime, right?
Yes, that is correct. I mean, it is a theoretical assessment there. And of course, that goes against the multiplier effect that's used for RFMBO fuels. So this is a balancing effect there. So yes, you do get it for the installed wind power assessed, as opposed to the actual use of that wind.
Got it. Okay, super interesting. Okay, I think with those updates in terms of the penalty and how the reward factor is actually derived, which is a very interesting point. In reality, it doesn't have to be in use; you still achieve it. And then let's move into the next question here for the panel. So, based on how the regulation is made, will this actually move the needle at all? Will it drive adoption higher? We've talked about that we see trends of further installations. It's tricky to connect it one-to-one with that regulation. Being in shipping, I would assume that eventually numbers also talk. So is it a good business case or not? And does this in fact move the needle? I'll start the other way around here, Jonas. From your perspective, based on how the regulation is built, will this actually be one of the things that pushes the industry to further adoption of wind?
I think in general, yes, there's of course are limitations on it right now because it's in the EU, and depending on how much you're trading in the EU, it might improve a business case for WAPS. But there's also, and Gavin can talk a lot more about this than I can, but there's of course also future things that are coming, and that's one of the things that Fuel EU is also doing, is setting a standard for things that are to come, and expected that more areas, countries, if not globally, it will be adopted. And in that sense, I do see that it will push things, and shipping has to move towards net zero. And if you follow other areas within shipping and reaching that, you see there is some potential delays in other uptake. So I'm quite sure that this is a thing that can help. And even though it's of course a capex heavy investment to do, but the more that it will be taken up, I'm also quite sure that suppliers at all will find ways of reducing the cost, and they will be easier adoptable. And the more vessels it has, it back to the question from Gunnar, when you do the assessment of what it is, more and more also measuring when it's installed and confirming the business case, confirming how much does actually do. The more you get of that, the better business cases will become, and the more it will also help fine tune the Fuel EU. So yes, I'm quite sure that it will help, but it's also the things it will push towards other areas adopting the same, I think will help.
Thanks, Jonas, and a very, I would say, concrete way of also getting a view on this. I mean, since you are doing business cases on behalf of owners, looking at whether it applies or not and whether it makes good business sense, have you seen instances where the element of Fuel EU Maritime actually takes the business case to a new level and crosses some kind of magic line, as talk return on investment, where then suddenly the owner is more comfortable making the choice of moving with wind-assisted propulsion?
Yes, there are cases, and of course, it comes back to the specific vessels and the owners, how they're operating them. But you can see where if you choose to operate it slightly different or aim to operate it differently, or you have a fixture that will push it more into the EU, that then it can take a business case from being 6-7 years to below 5 years or more, all depending on how much you're trading. So it can definitely help improve the business cases a lot.
See, this is interesting, right? And that's also why I wanted to arrive. And we'll take around also with you, Kate and Gavin, and also talk about how this regulation, it might be inspiring other, hopefully global regulations to take force. But I mean, what Jonas is describing here is a picture of an owner who's willing to change their operational pattern of the vessels to get the full benefit of a new regulation that kicks in, because it's an improved business case. So I guess it begs the question: if the FuelEU Maritime was a global concept or applied globally, then what would happen then? But I'll leave that hanging in the air, and then I'll move the same question here to you, Kate. So based on how the regulation is made, do you believe that this will move the needle, and will it drive the adoption higher?
Yeah, I think it will. I mean, I would have thought so. It's a simple way to comply with Fuel EU. So if you have a vessel burning fossil fuels with a greenhouse gas intensity of like 90.93, then you apply your multiplier. Even if you're only at 0.97, then suddenly you're compliant. You're at 88.2. Yeah, if you have options, like in our case, we're operating commercial pools. If we are offering vessels an owner's option, if possible, we'll try to keep those with wind propulsion trading in and out of the EU. Then, of course, it makes sense. And like you're insinuating, if and when the IMO midterm measures come into force, then it's applied globally in terms of the global fuel standard, which I've heard is potentially going to be more stringent in reductions, larger reductions quicker than the 2% we have in Fuel EU from 25 to 29. Then, of course, it just amplifies the business case. It makes it make even more sense. But there is no denying that ultimately owners will need to take this as part of a portfolio of measures. So ultimately, we have to transition away from fossil fuels and change the greenhouse gas intensity of the fuels we're using. So it's very much a part of a portfolio of measures that owners can use.
Yeah. So as I guess what you're saying, it's a tool in an owner's toolbox in order to comply and obviously also drive it at zero emissions. The tool has just become more enhanced now based on this new regulation, and there's a potential of it becoming even more enhanced if other regulations follow suit, basically. Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Super good thoughts here, Gavin. Your thoughts on this question?
Yeah. How much time have we got?
We
we
have
talk
lots
about
of
this
time,
hours on this one.
Drive me.
No, I did. We had both Kate and Jonas pulled up a couple of points that I would have made as well. That and very much so, it's one of the tools in the toolbox. What is interesting is from our perspective is we're seeing not just the driving factor for the early movers that would pretty much move anyway because they see a lot of the benefits in other areas. But we're seeing a lot of companies that are not in that early mover grouping or not naturally becoming increasingly interested and looking at these. They're picking up on that market message that the regulation isn't just there as a stick, it's there as a carrot. So it's bringing more and more ship owners into the conversation around wind propulsion, but also into that conversation about the broader decarbonization and broader zero emissions discussion. And really that was the subtext for all of the Fit 55 programs. Not one of these levers is going to make the final decision, but that kind of, if you like, that little bit of a tsunami, sometimes ship owners feel it's a bit of a tsunami coming at them is, okay, if we make a decision on this aspect, so if we do make a decision on wind propulsion, how is that impacting FEUM, and how does the two-way street on that? But also, does it give us benefits elsewhere? Does it make us compliant or reducing our EU ETS exposure, etc.? And also looking at that future regulatory pathway, and the GFI or GFS in IMO is an interesting point. It actually attacks this from a slightly different perspective. It's going from vessel as opposed to fuel. And we had a big argument within, or a big discussion, I should say, within the Fuel EU Maritime debate or deliberations, that wind propulsion is an energy source. Therefore, it is actually, in inverted commas, a fuel. So the Fuel EU Maritime should include all fuels. Just because it's a commoditized, pure zero emissions energy source shouldn't exclude it from the benefits of reducing the carbon intensity of the fuel itself. And the GFI takes a slightly different approach to that, where IMO does recognize wind as an energy source in the life cycle assessment. Therefore, it must be included in some form into a GFI discussion around the vessel. Yeah.
And that's actually, now we have a question which is very much on this point. And I would love to hear both your thoughts on it, Gavin, and also yours, Kate. So Adrian here is asking, in the current context, how do we see other regions in the world moving on equivalent regulations? So region or the global aspect of IMO. I mean, what will we see around the corner based on what the effect of, let's say, Fuel EU Maritime, but just also Fit for 55 now, and then how WAPS was introduced here? Are we expecting to see IMO come up with something where they are very much inspired by this, or similar regional regulations? Gavin, your quick thoughts on this?
Yes and no. I think, is that an appropriate answer? Oh, it's definitely a political one.
Short, at least. I would like you to expand on that.
Okay. The uptake of regional regulation is, in some ways, or many of the regions would argue, that's in a response to the lack of a global lead, or a lack of a global standard, or a lack of a global carbon price. So I think if we have IMO being ambitious and installing something that maybe surpasses what we have within the EU and other regions, then I can see those regions turning around and saying, well, you know, we can fold our regulation.
Yeah. Would you expect that so when we deep dive here on this topic, when we talk wind assisted propulsion, do you expect that IMO comes up with something similar where it's not just an EU ETS or a taxation scheme, global levy, but there's actually also incentivization for, let's say, technologies such as wind that will be introduced?
So, certainly the trend at the moment within the discussion is to include wind propulsion without actually incentivizing wind, is including it directly into the formula along with all other energy sources. So not a preferential treatment, but not an exclusionary one.
Okay. Kate, from your discussions, also from the work for the center, is that the same lines that are being pushed from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, we'd very much like to see this IMO measures come into force quite strongly. It's important to have this applying globally, like you said, not just applying to the regions. We want to see a strong market-based mechanism like a levy, and we want to see a strong global fuel standard with both a penalty and a reward. It's really important also to keep the reward factor to incentivize the uptake of these technologies and switching fuels. So yeah, I hope this does come into force in 2 years' time. And in the meantime, we have CSRD. We have a lot of our customers, our big customers now coming into scope and CSRD. So anything that we can do to reduce both owner and operator scope 1 emissions can also help our customers reduce their scope 3 emissions. So we're starting to see charterers become more and more interested in how their cargoes are transported. And we need their support. We need the charterers' support to want to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions in order to bridge the gap, bridge the cost gap. And in the same way that the industry needs these big orders in wind to go in to improve the technology and the uptake, we also need the support from the charterers to bridge that incremental cost of using these technologies and reducing emissions overall.
Yeah, okay. It all fits into the overall business case of being incentivized as an owner to actually start deploying these technologies. We've touched upon these elements a couple of times in determining, okay, so is it the right thing for me? I think now we've been through the Fuel EU Maritime, how it works, and a couple of examples of how it can potentially move the needle. Let's talk about how you build the business case. And Jonas, this is very much in your area, right? I mean, there's been a mentioning of multiple elements of how to define whether this is the right pathway or not. So building this business case, keeping all the commercial and technical options including, can be super complex, is my assumption. So what are the best practices here? What are we looking at from your perspective?
So I think we've covered quite a lot of it already. We have a slide here where you can see there's many things you need to look into. This is just some of them. I'll just highlight, of course, supplier is important, and how you're going to operate your vessels. And you have to think about how you're doing it today, is it also how you're going to do it in the future? And then can your vessel actually handle whatever wind system you're putting on board? Some has, depending on the fuels, you need hydraulics and electrical output, and different system has different requirements. So there's things you might need to add on top of it to actually have the vessel do it. And I think best practice is overall is really do your homework before you place an order for this kind of systems, because that will save you a lot of headaches down the line. There's a lot of things you need to look into, and every vessel is different. Of course, you can have sister groups where they're the same, but as we have one vessel in your fleet and then the other is not the same system you might want to put on board, depending on, as we already discussed, sizes, trades, deck space, and so on and so on. So main thing is really do your homework and understand what needs to be done before. And then in general, a thing that I run into a lot is everyone needs to keep in mind, basically, that when you decide to put wind on a vessel, that vessel will not be operated or cannot be operated as we used to do. It's a new way of operating it. There is compromises when you install. You get benefits, fuel and so on, but daily operations for the crew, for the technical managers, owners, and so on, it's a different ship, and it has to be done differently. Mooring might have to be done differently. The navigational assistant might need to be added. As I mentioned, other technologies to lower power consumption on board, so on and so on. So that's quite important. And then the last thing to highlight is, crew really need to remember to keep the crew on board with this, because they're the ones who have to live on board the vessel with these systems. So they need to understand and know how to use it and know why it's being put on board and so on.
I think it's a super good point. I just wanted to pull up. It's not a question we'll dive into, but Mikael is underlining the exact point that you have here, Jonas, that crew involvement is a crucial matter as well. And we tend to discuss high-level regulations and all kinds of different fancy technologies, but eventually the crew are the ones who are seeing the changes hands-on and needs to be aware and trained and capable of running these different technologies. So it was just to bring that up where we had the chance. Super. Thanks for highlighting. I want to just show the poll results of the poll that we kicked off in the beginning of the session, just to underline what was discussed here. So basically, we asked the question, building the business. Oh, sorry, have you calculated the business case behind applying wind assist propulsion on vessels in your fleet, including how FuelEU Maritime affects that specific return on investment? And here you can see that a third of our audience at least has not done that yet. And 27% know the FuelEU Maritime regulation and how it's incentivized in WAPS is not clear to me. I hope the session today has given some insights to the audience around how it works and where to seek more answers accordingly. 27% says yes, and the return on investment turns out favorable considering FuelEU Maritime and all other commercial aspects. Super interesting here. So 27% of our audience actually believes that when you pull everything together, the slide that you just showed, Jonas, and look at all the commercial aspects, including FuelEU Maritime, then it actually turns out favorable. Whereas 13% here says yes, and if return on investment does not turn out favorable considering FuelEU and all other aspects. Interesting points. Some reflections on this takeaway here from either of the panelists, Gavin, Kate, Jonas?
Yeah, I'm happy to make a comment. Well, hopefully the 60% that haven't really taken a look at this will move into the red zone or the green zone, as we'd like to call it, probably. I'd just like to mention maybe a couple of additional points, and I think Jonas picked up on some important points. The training and the crew we do need to remember that a lot of the systems are quite automated, and not always as yet fully integrated into the energy management system of vessels. But definitely there are some changes. But things like maintenance, we're talking about systems that have a fairly standard schedule of maintenance on them. But I didn't want to focus on that too much. One thing I did want to mention is around future proofing and to a degree, the modularity of wind as well. I was talking with some tanker owners recently that said, well, our vessels are 18, 19 years old. Why would we put wind on those? And there wasn't really an understanding that you don't need to scrap the wind system when you scrap the vessel. You can actually lift those off, put them onto new vessels and move those systems. Most of these systems, 20, 25-year lifespan. So you can actually be using those systems beyond the single vessel or the vessel that you've done your business model for. So there's that, and the future proofing against future upcoming regulation. I'll just give you one example. Underwater radiated noise is increasingly being looked at the IMO level. Wind propulsion, we will be doing more testing on this. But wind propulsion doesn't add to underwater radiated noise and effectively can reduce the power going through your propellers, etc., and make that further as a compliance option. We don't have the data to back that up yet, but that is certainly upcoming regulation. You have a pure zero emissions vessel, pure zero emissions technology. You are already on the first rung of compliance with those future regulations.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Some good insights, and thanks for running that through, Gavin. Your thoughts, reflections, Kate, on this reply from the poll?
I think it's important to quantify how much your fuel EU incentives can offset the costs for owners and do a full analysis of all your options, whether it's drop-in biofuels as a method of compliance or pooling or banking. Yeah, if you can, like Gavin said, view it as an increase in asset value, you have something that you can sell also at the end with wind-assisted propulsion. So yeah, a full analysis is needed. And of course, in long-term charters, you can discuss charter-owner collaboration. So there's many different models to split the financial and operational benefits.
Yeah, good point as well to actually share the risk and the upsides for all involved parties. Yeah, thanks, Kate. Jonas, any reflections from your side as the last point here on this slide?
No, I'm not surprised. To be honest, it's still a quite new thing, and it is still a bit of it's not for all, at least now, what people believe, but it is a matter of, as I mentioned, do some homework, look into it. Most fleets could benefit from it. The weather ROI is not favorable. Of course, for me, that could be for several reasons, right? But it's also a matter of course, did they pick the right system? And are they taking an off-the-shelf price or is it negotiated pricing? And this considering, as we also discussed, are you looking at it because you're looking at the vessel, it will trade as it always done, or are you looking at it on how are you going to change potentially, or what is this going to do in the future? Yeah. So it's quite interesting, but nothing surprising. It's quite in line with what we see.
Okay. Thanks a lot, and thanks for sharing your thoughts. And again, also thanks a lot to our audience for having replied on this poll. And that was the hour. That actually brings us to the conclusion of our session today. There are other questions in the chat. We'll try to address those subsequently in the chat as well. Thank you very much for the audience of posing all these great questions. We tried to cover some of them, but can't cover all due to time constraints. I now have the luxury of trying to recap what it is that we've talked about today, and that's always a fun challenge. But my reflections as we went through the session, I think we at least given a good insight, hopefully, to the audience around how wind-assisted propulsion is incentivized through this new regulation, how the calculation methodology work, the reward factor, and also some points around whether it's actual measured performance or it's actually the point of installing wind, making the calculation up front, and then that sets your reward factor. Then we talked about the uptake and how we see a trend of uptake in wind assist propulsion against the actual regulation. And here I think the numbers shared by you, Gavin, but also the timeline of events from your perspective, Kate, showed a really good example of the fact that we actually believe that the FuelEU Maritime as a regulation is now pushing the adoption of wind even further than what we saw before. We talked about doubling of the installations, and that's not even looking at the number of rigs installed on the vessels, because they also are seeing increases. We've talked about fleet-wide adoptions, and we've also talked about in which type of technologies are we seeing adoptions. It actually goes across. One technology is not for all. Some are betting their money on one technology, and some are actually looking at several technologies across the fleet. We talked about the necessity of looking at, is it right for all vessels in the fleet? And also, should you twist your trading of a vessel? And Jonas's points around that there are actually owners out there now seeing a good business case in adjusting the trading routes of the vessels to adhere to or to be taken into consideration of this regulation and add that in as a commercial element. And then suddenly the return on investment improves even further. Jonas talks about examples of where we've seen sub 5-year return on investment for vessels that he has looked at through Njord, which typically is that magical line that some ship owners at least are looking for when they look at investing. But interesting that the fact that the regulation can actually push the industry to change patterns. And then we moved into discussing, so what's next? Would we expect, for instance, IMO to somehow encounter wind? And I hear positive notes from both Kate and Gavin that we are hopeful to see that, not necessarily in the exactly same way, but wind as a technology will be included somewhere or another in the way that IMO sets its next guideline and regulations for emission reductions in the industry. So we are naturally super keen on revisiting that at some point. Summing everything up, saying it's not an easy decision making. There's a lot of different factors that goes in. Jonas showed us a slide around all the different elements that he helps prioritize and build business cases out from with the different owners that he works with. So getting your numbers straight, figuring out exactly whether wind is the right choice for you, for your fleet, for specific vessels. How can you make the pooling if it works? And can you somehow be creative in terms of how the cost incentive is split, owners, charters against each other, back to your point, Kate. So summarizing, I hope that we have given a good picture around how the regulation incentivizes wind assist propulsion and some very concrete examples of what to take into consideration when assessing, and also what we have seen from an owner's perspective, association perspective, and from a consultancy perspective currently in the market. That was my attempt to do a proper summary. I hope I did it justice. I want to thank Gavin, Kate, and Jonas for contributing today at the session. Your comments and insights have been great. I want to thank the audience for both posing some fantastic questions and also contributing to the polls that we ran. And thank you very much for dialing in today. We'll continue from Njord's perspective to explore how energy efficiency technologies are moving in the industry and how, for instance, regulations are pushing the boundaries here. So stay tuned for more LinkedIn Lives as we progress throughout the year. And then I wish everyone a nice day ahead. Thank you very much for dialing in. Bye.